My audience, college class called The Bible as Literature. I actually took this class in college.
Nice.
Basically, kind of analyzing the Bible as a document of literature from kind of different perspectives. So unfortunately, the class I took in college was like super postmodern and was like, there's no meaning.
Right.
So I'm not quite speaking to that audience, but I'm imagining that there are some people there who are like kind of from that mindset, and there's some people there who are genuinely trying to interact with it as literature. So that is what it is.
Great.
All right. Well, thank you all for having me here today. It is always a pleasure and a joy to speak with other people who are also fascinated by the Bible. I hope by the end of our time today, we will all be a little more fascinated by the Bible. I want to talk to you today about the Bible as literature from a Christian perspective. Now, I understand you've discussed this topic from a variety of perspectives, whether that's a Muslim perspective or an atheist perspective, a feminist perspective or a postmodern perspective. How would each of these people read the Bible? Today, I want to talk to you about how I, as a Christian, read the Bible. Now, I understand that there's a lot of different perspectives that Christians might have. I can only speak from my personal experience about how a Christian might read the Bible. What is that perspective exactly? Well, it's that the Bible has a point, but it might not be what you think. The Bible is trying to communicate a message just like any text or email that you might send, just like a regular book that you read. In short, the Bible is literature. But there are some unusual stories in the Bible. Now, we could explain these away as mistakes maybe, or different sources colliding with one another, but instead, I want to propose to you all that the unusual stories in the Bible are not mistakes, but descriptions of an unusual God. To understand this better, I want today to look at Mark 8, 1 to 21. The big number that you have on the sheets I've printed out for you is the chapter, Mark chapter 8, and the smaller numbers are the verse numbers. It'll be helpful if you have the sheet in front of you to follow along. Feel free to mark it up. I'm going to read the passage today, and then we'll get into it. Mark chapter 8. In those days, when again a great crowd had gathered and they had nothing to eat, he called his disciples to him and said to them, I have compassion on the crowd, because they have been with me now 3 days and have nothing to eat. And if I send them away hungry to their homes, they will faint on the way, and some of them have come from far away. And his disciples answered him, How can one feed these people with bread here in this desolate place? And he asked them, How many loaves do you have? And they said, 7. And he directed the crowd to sit down on the ground, and he took the 7 loaves, and having given thanks, he broke them and gave them to his disciples to set before the people. And they set them before the crowd. And they had a few small fish, and having blessed them, he said that these also should be set before them. And they ate and were satisfied. And they took up the broken pieces left over, 7 baskets full. And there were about 4,000 people. And he sent them away. And immediately he got into the boat with his disciples and went to the district of Dalmanutha. The Pharisees came and began to argue with him, seeking from him a sign from heaven to test him. And he sighed deeply in his spirit and said, Why does this generation seek a sign? Truly I say to you, no sign will be given to this generation. And he left them, got into the boat again, and went to the other side. Now they had forgotten to bring bread, and they had only 1 loaf with them on the boat. And he cautioned them, saying, Watch out, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the leaven of Herod. And they began discussing with one another the fact that they had no bread. And Jesus, aware of this, said to them, Why are you discussing the fact that you have no bread? Do you not yet perceive or understand? Are your hearts hardened? Having eyes, do you not see? And having ears, do you not hear? And do you not remember? When I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000, how many baskets full of broken pieces did you take up? They said to him, 12. And the 7 for the 4,000, how many baskets full of broken pieces did you take up? And they said to him, 7. And he said to them, Do you not yet understand? This is certainly an unusual story. I want to think about the main point of this text to try and prove to you that the Bible does have a point, even when it seems unusual. And to do that, I want to start our time thinking about satisfaction. This thought struck me, as all good thoughts do, while I was reading a jar of peanut butter. Satisfaction guaranteed. That's what it says on the side. How can they say that? How could they possibly guarantee satisfaction in their product? How could they know that for all people everywhere, they will be satisfied when they eat this peanut butter? Maybe it's just because they know that we're too lazy to call that number and complain about a jar of peanut butter. They know our standards have lowered so much that we'll just take what we can get. It is just peanut butter after all. But what about with the bigger things in life? What about the things that matter? Are you satisfied with your life? If you aren't, what do you think will make you satisfied? Will it be that job that you get after college that finally gives your life meaning? Maybe that relationship that will finally make you happy, that group of friends where you finally feel like you'll belong and you'll be satisfied. Now, these are good things, but these things aren't any more or less than we are. And we're the ones who are unsatisfied in the first place. So how can we expect them to satisfy us? The main point, I think, of this text is that the satisfaction that God provides doesn't meet our expectations, but it exceeds them. The satisfaction God provides does not meet our expectations, but it does exceed them. Our story has 3 parts today. As we work through, I wonder if you'll think with me about that point. What would it mean to be satisfied? The first part of the story I've titled Bountiful Provision. Let me just give you a setting. I don't know how familiar you are with the Bible, and we land right in the thick of things. There is apparently someone teaching. That's Jesus. Jesus has been preaching and teaching for a while. He's been healing and curing the sick. He's in the middle of his ministry. And he finds himself, again, surrounded by a great crowd. And the problem is, it's such a big crowd, they've had to go to a desolate place to fit everyone, and now they are far from food. People are hungry in the middle of the wilderness, which is a problem for sure, but it's not really Jesus' problem. I mean, he and the disciples finish up their teaching, thank you very much, and then let's go get some food. He could leave the people to themselves. But he doesn't respond in the usual way, because if we're honest, maybe that's how me or you would respond. That's how we often respond to other people's problems. But Jesus declares that he has compassion on the crowd. He responds to other people's problems by speaking of himself with compassion. Now, that's very nice. This sounds like a good teacher after all, but you might be a little bit skeptical. The disciples certainly are. I mean, they're like, come on, man, how are we going to feed these people? We don't have any food. Sure, you've done some great things, but there are thousands here. See, there's a real difference between talk and action, right? It's one thing to say something great, you have compassion, Jesus, but do you really have compassion? Are you really able to provide? Jesus certainly thinks so. He has everyone sit down. He gathers the food that they have, and he begins breaking it and passing it out. And breaking it and passing it out, and breaking it and passing it out over and over again until everyone is satisfied. In fact, the bread overflows in abundance. They have 7 baskets left over when they started with just 7 loaves. Jesus is not only compassionate in this story, he doesn't just feel for the people that are around him, he's actually able to help them. He's able to give them what they want. That's a nice story. That's a good story. You might feel like it sounds a little bit trite, though. Maybe you've heard that story before. God will provide. But we look around at our world, and it doesn't really look like that, right? It doesn't look like God is here providing. There are so many hungry people. There are so many sick people. Even in a nation that has so much wealth, we could provide for everyone. We are right now in an age where we are capable of making enough food and delivering that food to people so that everyone could have what they need. But we don't, because we don't have compassion. We live in a world that is compassionless. And so people go hungry and people die. Where's God in all that? Where's a God who says that he provides? It is a nice story. But that's not the end of the story. We've still got so many verses to go. See, I think that's usually where we cut it off. But it doesn't end there. And this is where things get really unusual. Jesus sends everyone away. He fed the crowds. He broke the food. He fed them. And then he abandons them, basically. He sends them away and he gets in his boat and he leaves. Why? I mean, if he's so compassionate, if he cares so much for these people, why wouldn't he set up shop? Why wouldn't he start a food bank and a clinic to help these people with their needs? That would be a nice story, but I'm thankful that the story doesn't end there. I'm thankful that the story continues because this is the beginning of a far better story. Yeah, a little bread in a hungry time is nice, but it's not finally satisfying. They're going to be hungry again tomorrow. These people have a greater problem. You and I have a greater problem. We all want satisfaction, but friends, it's going to turn out that satisfaction is different than we expect. And so we begin this better story. We find ourselves in the second act, which I've titled Skeptical Opposition. We had bountiful provision, and now we have skeptical opposition. Sort of an odd transition, not a lot of segue here with Mark. Why would he include this? I mean, he leaves, and then immediately he begins to be questioned. Turns out even in his own time, not everyone was on board with this Jesus guy. You might think to yourself, I mean, who wouldn't like Jesus based on this story, right? He just fed tons of people. Turns out that the people who don't like Jesus are the religious elite. Big surprise, right? That's what these Pharisees are. They're the religious elite of the day, and they got beef with Jesus. They come asking for a sign from heaven, which might seem a little bit weird, considering what just happened in the story. I mean, that feels like a bit of a sign from heaven to me. And then weirder than that is Jesus is like, no, I'm not going to give you one, which is super strange because he just did. He just did exactly like that. It's like everyone in the story has suddenly developed amnesia. They've just forgotten what's happened. Again, when we're reading the Bible as literature, we could declare this to be a mistake, maybe, or an extra source that got slipped in later. That might be true. But what if, just for a moment, we trust that Mark wrote this with a purpose, that he wrote this message to communicate a point? What then? We'd have to conclude that both Jesus and the Pharisees know exactly what's going on. See, the Pharisees understand Jesus' claims far better than we do. That trick with the bread, that's not just a great provision that Jesus gave to the people. It's not just a magic trick. The only person in the Bible who's ever been able to provide bread for people like that is God. God is the only one who's ever been able to feed his people like that. The Pharisees know Jesus' claim is not just to be a good teacher, but to be the very Son of God. That's how this book starts out. And we continue to see it. They also understand that if they define the sign, if they get to choose how Jesus proves himself, then they can fit God into their paradigm. They define the sign, they define the Savior. This might actually be what you hate most about Christians, right? They take God and they fit him into their paradigm. Perhaps like me, you'd wish Christians would read the Bible. They might see that God is really different than they think. He doesn't fit in their box. If January 6th taught us anything, it's the danger of fitting God in your paradigm, of making God do what you want him to do, of defining him on your terms. It is the greatest evil. Because when you define God on your terms, you don't really want God. You are God. Friends, I'm thankful that God doesn't fit into my paradigm. I would make a terrible God. What about you? Are you willing to set aside your paradigm for a moment to hear God on his own terms? We make terrible gods. Our country is proof of that. Our lives are proof of that. We follow every philosophy that promises pleasure and purpose for our lives, and we only get pain. make terrible gods. But the good news of our passage today is that God provides satisfaction in abundance. And it is a satisfaction on his terms, not ours. It is important to know what his terms are, right? It brings us to our third act in the story. We had bountiful provision, and then skeptical opposition. Finally, we have spiritual vision. Again, we find ourselves with the problem of hunger. But this time, it's not the crowds, it's the disciples. They've forgotten to bring bread, which is a big problem. Does Jesus make more bread? No, he begins teaching them about bread. That's what that leaven is. Just in case you're not all first century bakers. Leaven is sort of similar to yeast. They would take kind of some of the old fermented dough and they would mix it in with the new dough to germinate that dough. So what's Jesus talking about here? He's warning his disciples of the infectious attitude of the Pharisees, these religious leaders. Man, I wish we could know what that attitude was, right? Oh, shoot. Skeptical opposition. Maybe this story makes a little bit more sense now, right? Why that middle section is there. It's not a mistake. It's not an extra source. It's an illustration of the Pharisees' attitude so that when Jesus says this, it all begins to make sense. Jesus is warning his disciples of the failure to see him as provider. He's warning his disciples of unbelief. And the disciples are like, hey, for sure, man, I get that. Absolutely. We still don't have bread. Which would normally be a fair point, right? Let's get back to the situation at hand, Jesus. We don't have any bread, except sitting in the boat with them is the divine baker. I mean, he's the guy who just fed 4,000 people with 7 loaves. Sure. This is not a concern. And Jesus asks them the very question we've got to be wondering as we read this story. Why are you discussing bread? Now, we could give all sorts of answers to that question. Maybe they're just really hungry. They're not thinking straight. But look at what Jesus says. They don't have eyes to see. See what? I mean, they certainly saw the miracles, right? They themselves attest to that later on. They know how many baskets they picked up afterward. They saw what happened, what Jesus did. But they continue to obsess over such small things. No, what the disciples failed to see was their real need in this moment. They perceive their need to be a lack of bread. They don't see their need, lack of satisfaction in any real way. And even worse than that, they're doing so next to the very person who has demonstrated above everything else that he is capable and compassionate to provide. What are the terms of satisfaction? Eyes to see your greatest need. This is a ridiculous story of disciples who should be the only ones, the most capable of seeing who Jesus is and his ability to provide, and they can't even see. What hope is there for us, right? It is a ridiculous story, but I think it is a story with good news. Because we are ridiculous people, aren't we? We search for meaning and satisfaction in such small things. Things that couldn't possibly satisfy. J.D. Salinger wrote in his novel Franny and Zooey, everything everybody does, it's not wrong or even mean or even stupid, but just so tiny and meaningless and sad-making. That is so often our lives, isn't it? It's tiny and meaningless and sad-making. You might not think this story sounds like good news at all. You might want to abandon the Christian perspective at all costs at this point. And you're right, on its own, this story isn't good news. It ends with Jesus asking, don't you understand? And the disciples clearly don't. It's haunting question. Because if we're honest, none of us really understand, do we? What do we really need? I mean, if we'd figured that one out, wouldn't we be a lot more satisfied? Wouldn't we be a lot less angry and depressed and anxious all the time? But don't you want to? Don't you want to know? See, the good news of our passage is found chapters later in this same book. This Jesus who provided food freely for the crowds will be mocked and jeered by those same crowds as he walks to his death. We need rescue from ourselves. In Ephesians 2, we see something amazing. As Paul looks back on these events and writes about them, he declares that we're not just blind. It's not just that we can't see, but that we're actually dead. Our lives have been utterly ruined by ourselves. We have rejected the only one who can actually provide any meaning, any satisfaction in our lives. We need rescue from ourselves and from our tiny and meaningless and sad-making lives. We've set ourselves up as gods, fit God into our own paradigms, and we're left to our own devices. Except God provides in abundance. That's the news of this story, right? God provides in abundance. Be rescued from ourselves. Not because we do something necessarily, but it's a free gift that God provides. That's what salvation is when Christians talk about it, is rescue from a life of tiny and meaningless and sad making because someone else died where you should have. Now, I want to be clear. I'm not saying that your life will be magically perfect. That man, you'll just feel so good all the time. That is a Christian-flavored American dream, and it's a lie. The world is messed up. But what I am telling you is that you will be finally satisfied in a way that you never can be on your own. Because you will be in right relationship with a God, the only one who can actually provide satisfaction. The satisfaction that God provides doesn't meet our expectations. It doesn't fit into our paradigms, but it does exceed them. It is far better than anything we have. How can we have guaranteed satisfaction? We need someone greater than ourselves, someone who is able to provide in a way that we can't. The Bible does have a point after all. It's not just a collection of stories, different authors, different sources. No, it does have a point. It just might not be what you expected. Thank you.